Good afternoon from the Indian Himalayas, where I've been for the past few weeks trying to improve my yoga and meditation skills. I don't really know where I'm going at the moment. The monsoon season's officially finished, but we had a lot of rain last night and it might not be over yet. And I've been discouraged from walking in the bush, probably because I get lost, but officially because there's been so many landslides that it's not a particularly smart thing to do at the moment. So I'm going to walk up this road. I'm told there's a small village about 3 kilometers up here. There's another one 3 kilometers up this hill here at the top, which I might try and do over the next couple of days. We'll see where this road takes me. As they say in India, there are no obstructions, there's only the way. So let's see where this way takes me. Okay, so this is part 3 of my series on Fearless, Mitochondria, Gold and God, where I'm looking at the hypothesis of mine that science is actually causing a convergence in spirituality and science rather than a divergence. Yeah, see, so apparently I can cross over that bridge down there somewhere, just underneath that tree, and takes me through that village and then up into those hills up there to another village. That'll be for next week or next few days. Okay, so this will be part 3. I think we'll be fine from a monsoon perspective, and that's the river I've been swimming in each day, which is which flows into the Ganges a couple of kilometers downriver. And in fact, some of the talk we'll do today about new research on mitochondria, brown fat and cancer will be some more good reasons for why I actually do try and get into some cold water every day. Okay, but first of all, as usual with the structure of these videos, I'm going to start off on some spiritual quotes on fearlessness, because it doesn't really matter which spiritual text you look at. Fearlessness is always one of, if not the number one virtue that they say we need to live in this world. So the first quote is a biblical quote, comes from the chapter John, and it goes, "In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can't overcome it." The second quote comes from the yogic philosophy, and it's something like, "All our fears and anxieties come from a mistaken identity. The fear comes from confusing the self and the non-self." So for us to be fearless, we have to drop the false identity. All right, well, let's go on to chapter 2 of this series, and chapter 2 is about mitochondrial science. And just in case you forgot, remember, none of this is medical advice, just me walking and talking about things that interest me in the Himalayas. See this medical disclaimer and the video disclaimer at the end of this video. Chapter 3 is about new mitochondrial research. So last week we talked about the science which says that the universe was created 15 billion years ago. The Earth came around 5 billion years ago. Mitochondria appeared 3 billion years ago. And eukaryotes, i.e. everything else other than bacteria, so plants, fungi, animals, came around 1.5 billion years ago. And we also discussed how the planets, according to science, had come from the Big Bang Theory, which suggests that 15 billion years ago, something called a singularity suddenly exploded into some neutrons and protons, which eventually coalesced to some atoms, which then eventually formed some helium and hydrogen, which eventually formed into 300 septillion planets scattered through our own universe, and there may actually be what we call the multiverse, where there are multiple universes. Now next week it's really going to get juicy, because we're going to talk about where mitochondria came from and how that then allowed the development of multicellular organisms, because bacteria are stuck as a unicellular species. You can only have one cell, and that's due to the way they produce energy. So bacteria here alone for 1.5 billion years. Now, to have bacteria, you have to have three things. You have to have chemistry, i.e. the protein structure they're made up of. You have to have energy, it's how they get around and do all the things that cause a lot of problems they do, and the good things, I suppose. And you also have to have movement. Okay, to have structure, you have to have a chemistry set. Well, we can all accept there was a chemistry set on planet Earth. To have movement, they had to have a fuel source, and that was okay, because this thing called a sun spraying the Earth with radiation and electrons, and they had to have movement. Yes, they had batteries to power that movement. Now here's the really interesting thing, and this is a really key fact to remember that I find fascinating, because it's the explanation for one major hypothesis in science. Question is there another explanation? And that is that the battery which powers any living species on planet Earth, doesn't matter if you're a bacteria, a fungi, a lion or a human, is movement of protons back and forth across a membrane. Now we're going to go into that in depth over the next few weeks, but just write that down, because it's absolutely critical to following the trail of life on this planet, and the decision about whether you go left and think that because every single living organism on this planet uses the same way to create energy, which is by pumping protons across a membrane, that either suggests one of two things. It suggests that there was a common ancestor, and we're going to look at that theory over the next few weeks, because if we're all using exactly the same system, we must have come from a shared ancestor. Or it suggests that system, which has apparently been around for, 3 billion years, and is unchanged, kind of like that melatonin video I did, unchanged in 3 billion years, not improved on, and it mobilizes every life form on this planet. Then if it's that good and it was designed 3 billion years ago and has not been improved on, then you would think it would not be unreasonable to suggest that may have had some intelligent design behind it. It's a bit like when we talked about movement of bacteria. I suggest you Google E. coli, the bacteria which lives in our colon and also causes some people lots of problems with urinary tract infections. But it moves around with what's called a flagella, which is kind of like a big tail, which it moves in a figure of 8 movement for it to move through fluids. But if you Google structure of the E. coli flagella, I'll put a slide up with, I can't put a picture up, but I'll put a slide up of the protein components that 3 billion year old bacteria uses to move itself around. which has got C rings, D rings, E rings, lubricating fluid. The list is about 12 long, and the pictures look like it's as sophisticated as a Boeing 747 jet engine. It's hard to believe that that was just created out of some amorphous proteins on the bottom of the ocean. Oh, bungee jump up in the Himalayas. Where is it? There it is. Done it once in Queenstown. Don't need to do it again. Tick that box. Oh, and it was also puts in perspective the quote by world famous astrophysicist Fred Hoyle, and I'll put the quote on a slide as well just so you can read it. But it basically said that the chances of random proteins and salts from an amorphous goop of an ocean coming together to form organised cells is about as likely as a tornado going through a rubbish tip and spontaneously creating a Boeing 747 jet. So pretty unlikely. Now, I didn't say that. Fred Hoyle, astrophysicist, said that. And even if we accept that a whole bunch of proteins came together as sophisticated as a Boeing 747 jet engine to transport around a E. coli bacteria, then there still is no explanation for consciousness or intelligent life, because I can throw a bunch of proteins together on a plate, but they're not going to spontaneously assemble and walk off the table, because you need consciousness to be able to do that. And we don't really have an explanation for the singularity concept of the Big Bang. We don't have an explanation for consciousness or life. So those are the mysteries we're still trying to work out. Look at those sunbeams. It's crazy. The sun. Some magic in that planet, that's for sure. Okay, so that's the background. Next week, or next few days, next video I get to do, depending on how much yoga I have to do, we'll be getting on to what I really want to get into, which is mitochondria. Because until mitochondria came around, there was just bacteria. Then, as we know, one bacteria engulfs another bacteria once in the history of 15 billion years and creates this new organism, which, because of our shared energy systems with all life on Earth, has to be our common ancestor. And you might be really interested to see some of the hypothesis on who that common ancestor might have been. Because ultimately, that organism with the mitochondria allowed multicellular species to develop. Bacteria, according to science, for 5 billion years have remained as single cellular organisms, and it was only the development of mitochondria which allowed multicellular species to develop on this planet. Now, we're not going to get into whether or not there might be life on other planets, because that's way out of area of my expertise. I know a lot about the mitochondria, but I don't really know anything about life on other planets. Don't think anybody does. But I do think it's kind of the height of human arrogance to think that this must be the only planet, considering there are, what did we say last week, 300 septillion planets in our universe, and there may be multiple universes. Okay, and let's just say that this is the only planet which has the right combination of oxygen and water, etc., to support life. Well, I just think that, to me, I can imagine an early human species walking out of the jungles or the forests and looking at the ocean going, well, it's very pretty, nice to swim in, but there can't be any life in that, because you need to suck in this thing called air to be able to stay alive. And there's obviously no air in that thing we're going to call water. Well, well, they must have got a real surprise when they came along, some fish and some octopus, very happily living in a system which was completely different to inhaling air to power your mitochondria. And I just think that you've got to think that with all those planets and multiple possible other ways of generating movement in life, that there's a good chance in those 300 septillion planets that there would be other life forms. Okay, what have we got to now? AJ Hackett from New Zealand started a worldwide phenomenon, because here we are up in the Himalayas with some nobody jumping today though. Okay, let's get on to chapter 3 of this video, which is about new mitochondrial research. And as usual, I'll put the screenshots of the studies at the end of the video so you can check them yourself. And these studies are about brown fat, the inner mitochondrial membrane, and cancer. So we're going to go into detail about the inner mitochondrial membrane next week, because that's the key to all life. But the key concept I want to talk about today, which we've alluded to previously, is what's called mitochondrial uncoupling. Now, we talked about that last week. So, as we know, normally we pass electrons along the inner mitochondrial membrane, along the respiratory proteins, and as they move along, they create an energy which pumps protons from the matrix of the mitochondria through the inner mitochondrial membrane to the intermitochondrial space. Those proteins build up in pressure. It's kind of like pumping water uphill to a dam at the top. And then when you unleash that water, the water rushes downhill. You can create energy from that. Exactly the same principle. Now, things can go wrong with that system, and that's coming up in future. But one of the solutions to a problem with that system is what's called mitochondrial uncoupling. Now, mitochondrial uncoupling is where the permeability of the inner mitochondrial membrane is changed, and it allows protons to leak back from the intermembrane space, but instead of coming back through ATPase and spinning it to create energy, they just leak back through the membrane. So you're using those hydrogens bursting back through, but they're bursting back through a usually impermeable membrane, so they're not spinning ATPase, they're not creating energy, but they're creating heat. And as I said last week, that's like hopping on a bike with the chain off the reel, pedaling like crazy, getting hot, but not going anywhere on the bike. Same thing. You're allowing hydrogen molecules to come back through a usually impermeable inner mitochondrial membrane without producing ATP, but producing heat. That's what uncoupling is about. And remember, last week we talked about the ways that you can do that, is particularly with fasting. And we're also going to talk today how you can also do that with cold thermogenesis by getting in cold water. Now, one of the benefits of uncoupling is that as well as producing heat, which, remember, that allows warm-blooded animals, because you don't have to lie in the sun for 3 hours to get your body to normal temperature like cold-blooded animals do, but it also decreased the production of reactive oxygen species, i.e. pollution, and it also allowed a decrease of blood sugar, because you're still burning food to pump the electrons along the inner mitochondrial membrane, but you're not creating ATP. Because you think, okay, well, what's wrong with creating more ATP? I'd like to have more energy. Well, that's for next week, because that does come with issues of its own by creating too much ATP when it's not needed. Now, brown fat has a special protein in it called UCP1 uncoupling protein 1, which allows for this leak of proteins back across the membrane, avoiding ATPase. Uncoupling protein 1. Now, the really cool thing about the new research is it's shown that brown fat activation Remember, that's what one of the things that cold thermogenesis does, because it wants our brown fat to start producing heat to warm us up. And brown fat activation can help suppress cancer growth. According to these studies, which I've screenshotted at the end of the video, suppresses cancer growth by competing with the cancer cells for glucose, which are the preferred fuel for cancer cells. And also remember, the key for some of this is remembering that we can use protein, fat and glucose for energy production by shuttling electrons into the mitochondria, but that requires oxygen to produce the energy. Yet glucose is the only food source that can be used to produce energy without oxygen. And of course, that's called anaerobic metabolism. And we know that that's the preferred way of creating energy by cancer cells. And that, as we've discussed previously, is called the Warburg effect, where cancer cells preferably use the anaerobic pathway to create energy, even when, it's a key bit, even when oxygen is present in adequate amounts. Because all of us can use anaerobic metabolism, see that in the emergency environment all the time, when we need to create energy and for whatever reason there's not enough oxygen to do that. But cancer cells use that preferably to create energy even when there's no oxygen shortage, and that's called the Warburg effect. And remember, they do that during the day but not at night, because what stops them doing at night? Melatonin stops them using the Warburg effect to use the preferred means of energy production. And cancer cells do that by what's called hyperpolarizing the inner mitochondrial membrane, which makes it more negative, changes the role of the respiratory proteins and the electron flow, and allows the switch to the Warburg effect with the preferential use of, I'm not sure where I'm going now, the preferential use of the anaerobic metabolism pathway with the creation of lactate. And remember, lactate is an acid, and cancer cells like using the lactate to create a more acidic environment, which allows tumor growth in tissues because they like the acidic environment of the local environment. And finally, several mouse studies recently have shown that brown fat activation and the uncoupling of the proton flow has an anti-cancer effect. So that took longer than I thought, because I find it fascinating myself, especially because I'm so passionate about the cold thermogenesis. And I tell you, I've been doing so much work on what we call in the yoga world pranayama, which has been around for 3,000 years, or more recently, breath work to increase my lung capacity, efficiency of my lungs. It's been really good fun getting my breath hold on inhalation up to, I think I got up to 2 minutes 52 seconds the other day. Not saying that through ego, it's just, it's a lot better than it used to be, that's for sure. So I'll just quickly finally talk about gold. And I was watching an interesting video about gold and its value as money, saying that it's not scarcity which makes gold valuable since the dawn of time, but it's arduous. The fact that gold is arduous, and I'll explain that in a second, is what's made it valuable. Because lots of things are scarce but not worth anything. 10 years ago I did, for a couple of weeks, a course on painting, and I did 3 paintings. So paintings by Greg Emerson are very scarce, but they're not valuable, that's for sure. Painted an apple, painted Mount Taranaki where my mother was born, and something else I can't remember. But very scarce, but no value. Now what arduous means is it's very difficult to inflate the money, which means, as we said last week, it's very difficult to produce more. Gold increases by 1.7% per year, I could do a new painting 3 times a day. So not arduous. Not scarce after a while, but certainly not arduous. So it's the fact that gold is arduous, very difficult to produce more every year, which gives its value, as does it to Bitcoin. And several other cryptocurrencies, because it's in the software of Bitcoin, which can't be changed, that there'll only ever be 21 million. Now, the fact that there's only ever going to be 21 million doesn't mean that there's not enough for everybody, because every Bitcoin is divided into, I think it's, from memory, 100,000 Satoshis. I'll have to double check that. I'll put that in the video when I'm editing it. So soon we're going to stop talking about Bitcoin. We'll just be talking about Satoshis. There are also, I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, there's a lot of other very, very good cryptocurrencies which have a fixed supply, but certainly that's one of my criteria for looking at a cryptocurrency, is that it has a fixed supply which can't be altered. And lastly, I want to talk about my work on the flow state and accessing increased level of consciousness. And a big take-home message for me, doing a lot of meditation practice, is that it requires a lot of patience and a lot of practice. The flow state, which is kind of the entry door to the increased level of consciousness, doesn't come easily. Nobody watches F1, the Brad Pitt movie, and goes, oh well, namaste. Namaste. It was really easy for Brad Pitt to stop time while he won the race. So it does require a lot of effort, a lot of practice, a lot of technology, a lot of routine, and you can't bypass that. It's kind of like opening a seed of a big tree, one of the seeds of these trees. We open that seed, there's no little tree inside that seed. There's an intelligence inside that seed that, given the right circumstances, right environment, right enough time, will develop into a massive tree. So for me, I've stopped being disappointed sometimes with the results of my meditation, and I'm concentrating on learning new techniques to try and accelerate the process. But nonetheless, understand now that there's a lot of routine, a lot of technology, a lot of practice involved, a lot of tools that I can use to get through the door of flow state into those 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th levels of consciousness, which we're going to be talking about in the coming months. Right, I got no idea where I am. Somewhere up by an abandoned house. Anyway, I'll find a good spot with a good view and close this video. All right, that's it from me. As usual, always remember, doesn't matter how much it hurts, how dark it gets, or how far you fall, you're never out of the fight. And grace comes if you're grace worthy, but grace comes. Namaste, peace and love from me. See you next week. Bye. And remember that after nearly 6 years, I remain suspended in nutritional environmental medicine and can only work as an emergency specialist in a public hospital. So none of this is health or medical advice, and certainly does not replace a professional relationship with your own healthcare provider. And just because I go jumping in freezing cold water doesn't mean anybody else should without adequate training in the hormetic principles of contrast therapy.